We shall now go back to the endings in search of a few more principles, then again to the middle game, and finally to the openings once more, so that the advance may not only be gradual, but homogeneous. In this way, the foundation on which we expect to build the structure will be firm and solid. In the position shown above, White can draw by playing pawn to b4, according to the general rule that governs such cases, i.e., to advance the pawn that is free from opposition. But suppose that White, either because he does not know this principle, or because he does not, in this case, sufficiently appreciate the value of its application. Suppose we say that he plays pawn to a4. Then Black can win by playing pawn to a5, applying one of the cardinal principles of the high strategy of chess. Unit that holds two. In this case, one pawn would hold two of the opponent's pawns. The student cannot lay too much stress on this principle. It can be applied in many ways, and it constitutes one of the principal weapons in the hands of a master. The example given should be sufficient proof. We give a few moves of the main variation. Pawn to a4. This is Black's best move. We will see why. Again, Black's best. This brings the game to a position which is won by Black, and which constitutes one of the classical endings of king and pawns. I shall try to explain the guiding idea of it to those not familiar with it. In this position, White's best line of defense consists in keeping his pawn where it stands at h2. As soon as the pawn is advanced, it becomes easier for Black to win. On the other hand, Black's plan to win, supposing that White does not advance his pawn, may be divided into three parts. The first part will be to get his king to h3, at the same time keeping intact the position of his pawns. This is all important, since, in order to win the game, it is essential at the end that Black may be able to advance his rearmost pawn 1 or 2 squares, according to the position of the White king. If king to g4, pawn to g6 will win. King to g2. The first part has been completed. The second part will be short and will consist in advancing the rook pawn up the king. This ends the second part. The third part will consist in timing the advance of the knight pawn so as to play pawn to g3 when the White king is at h1. It now becomes evident how necessary it is to be able to move the knight pawn either 1 or 2 squares according to the position of the White king, as indicated previously. In this case, as it is White's move, the pawn will be advanced 2 squares, since the White king will be in the corner. But if it were now Black's move, the knight pawn should only be advanced 1 square, since the White king is at g1. The h-pawn takes g3. If king to g1, pawn to g2. King to h2 and wins. It is in this analytical way that the student should try to learn. He will thus train his mind to follow a logical sequence in reasoning out any position. This example is excellent training, since it is easy to divide it into 3 stages and to explain the main point of each part. The next subject we shall study is the simple opposition. But before we devote our time to it, I wish to call attention to 2 things. When 3 or more pawns are opposed to each other, in some such position as the one in example 24, there is always a chance for one side or the other of obtaining a passed pawn. In the above position, the way of obtaining a passed pawn is to advance the center pawn. The A pawn takes b6. If the C pawn takes b6, pawn to a6. Pawn to a6, and as in this case, the white pawn is nearer to queen than any of the black pawns, white will win. Now, if it had been black's move, black could play pawn to b6. It would not be advisable to try to obtain a passed pawn because the white pawns would be nearer to queen than the single black pawn. The A pawn takes b6, and the game properly played would be a draw. The student should work this out for himself. When two pawns are free, or will be free to advance to queen, you can find out by counting which pawn will be the first to succeed. In this position, whoever moves first wins. The first thing is to find out, by counting, whether the opposing king can be in time to stop the passed pawn from queening. When, as in this case, it cannot be done, the point is to count which pawn comes in first. In this case, the time is the same, but the pawn that reaches the 8th square first and becomes a queen is in a position to capture the adversary's queen when he makes one. Thus, pawn to a4. Now comes a little calculation. White can capture the pawn, but if he does so when queening, he will not command the square where black will also queen his pawn. Therefore, instead of taking, he plays pawn to a6, pawn to a8, promoting to a queen, and wins. The student would do well to acquaint himself with various simple endings of this sort, so as to acquire the habit of counting, and thus be able to know with ease when he can or cannot get there first. Once again, I must call attention to the fact that a book cannot by itself teach how to play. It can only serve as a guide, and the rest must be learned by experience, and if a teacher can be had at the same time, so much the faster will the student be able to learn. When kings have to be moved, and one player can, by force, bring his king into a position similar to the one shown in the following diagram, so that his adversary is forced to move and make way for him, the player obtaining that advantage is said to have the opposition. Suppose in the above position, white plays king to d4. Now black has the option of either opposing the passage of the white king by playing king to d6, or, if he prefers, he can pass with his own king by replying king to f5. Notice that the kings are directly opposed to each other, and the number of intervening squares between them is odd, 1 in this case. The opposition can take the form shown above, which can be called actual or close frontal opposition, or this form, which can be called actual or close diagonal opposition, or again this form, which can be called actual or close lateral opposition. In practice, they are all one and the same. The kings are always on squares of the same color. There is only one intervening square between the kings, and the player who has moved last has the opposition. Now, if the student will take the trouble of moving each king backwards, as in a game, in the same frontal, diagonal, or lateral line, respectively shown in the diagrams, we shall have what may be called distant frontal, diagonal, and lateral opposition, respectively. The matter of the opposition is highly important and takes at times somewhat complicated forms, all of which can be solved mathematically. But for the present, the student should only consider the most simple forms. An examination of some of the examples of king and pawns endings already given will show several cases of close opposition. In all simple forms of opposition, when the kings are on the same line, and the number of intervening squares between them is even, the player who has the move has the opposition. The above position shows to advantage the enormous value of the opposition. The position is very simple. Very little is left on the board, and the position, to a beginner, probably looks absolutely even. It is not the case, however. Whoever has the move wins. Notice that the kings are directly in front of one another, and that the number of intervening squares is even. Now, as to the procedure to win such a position, the proper way to begin is to move straight up. Thus, king to e2. Now white can exercise the option of either playing king to d5 and thus passing with his king, or of playing king to f4 and prevent the black king from passing, thereby keeping the opposition. Mere counting will show that the former course will only lead to a draw. Therefore, white takes the latter course and plays king to g6. If king to e6, king to g5 will win. Now, by counting, it will be seen that white wins by capturing black's knight pawn. The process has been comparatively simple in the variation given above, but black has other lines of defense more difficult to overcome. Let us begin anew. Now, if king to d3, king to d7, or if king to e3, king to e7, and black obtains the opposition in both cases. When the kings are directly in front of one another and the number of intervening squares between the kings is odd, the player who has moved last has the opposition. Now, in order to win, the white king must advance. There is only one other square where he can go, f3, and that is the right place. Therefore, it is seen that in such cases, when the opponent makes a so-called waiting move, you must advance, leaving a rank or file free between the kings. Therefore, we have. Now, it would be bad to advance, because then black, by bringing up his king in front of your king, would obtain the opposition. It is white's turn to play a similar move to black's first move, namely king to e3, which brings the position back to the first variation shown. The student would do well to familiarize himself with the handling of the king in all examples of opposition. It often means the winning or losing of a game. The following position is an excellent proof of the value of the opposition as a means of defense. White is a pawn behind and apparently lost, yet he can manage to draw as follows. King to h1. The position of the pawns does not permit white to draw by means of the actual or close opposition. Hence, he takes the distant opposition. In effect, if king to f1, actual or close opposition, king to d3, and white cannot continue to keep the lateral opposition essential to his safety because of his own pawn at f3. On the other hand, after the text move, if king to d2, king to g4, attacking the pawn and forcing black to play king to e3 when he can go back to g3, as already shown, and always keep the opposition. Going back to the original position, if king to h1, white does not play the f-pawn takes g4 because pawn to e4 will win, but plays king to g2. If the g-pawn takes f3, check, king takes f3, followed by king to e4, will draw. King to d2, pawn to e4, and mere counting will show that both sides queen, drawing the game. If the student will now take the trouble to go back to the examples of king and pawns which I have given in this book, He will realize that in all of them, the matter of the opposition is of paramount importance, as, in fact, it is in nearly all endings of king and pawns, except in such cases where the pawn position in itself ensures the win. Before turning our attention to this matter, it is well to state now that two knights alone cannot mate, but, under certain conditions of course, they can do so if the opponent has one or more pawns. In the above position, white cannot win, although the black king is cornered. But in the following position, in which black has a pawn, white wins with or without the move. Thus, knight to g6. White cannot take the pawn because the game will be drawn, as explained before. The reason for this peculiarity in chess is evident. White with the two knights can only stalemate the king unless black has a pawn which can be moved. Although he is a bishop and a pawn ahead, the following position cannot be won by white. It is the greatest weakness of the bishop that when the rook's pawn queens on a square of opposite color and the opposing king is in front of the pawn, the bishop is absolutely worthless. All that black has to do is to keep moving his king close to the corner square. In the above position, white, with or without the move, can win. Take the most difficult variation. Now that we have seen these exceptional cases, we can analyze the different merits and the relative value of the knight and the bishop. It is generally thought by amateurs that the knight is the more valuable piece of the two, the chief reason being that, unlike the bishop, the knight can command both black and white squares. However, the fact is generally overlooked that the knight, at any one time, has the choice of one color only. It takes much longer to bring a knight from one wing to the other. Also, as shown in the following example, a bishop can stalemate a knight, a compliment which the knight is unable to return. The weaker the player, the more terrible the knight is to him, but as a player increases in strength, the value of the bishop becomes more evident to him, and of course, there is, or should be, a corresponding decrease in his estimation of the value of the knight as compared to the bishop. In this respect, as in many others, the masters of today are far ahead of the masters of former generations. While not so long ago, some of the very best amongst them, like Pillsbury and Chigorin, preferred knights to bishops, there is hardly a master of today who would not completely agree with the statements made above. This is about the only case when the knight is more valuable than the bishop. It is what is called a block position, and all the pawns are on one side of the board. If there were pawns on both sides of the board, there would be no advantage in having a knight. In such a position, black has excellent chances of winning. Of course, there is an extra source of weakness for white in having his pawns on the same color squares as his bishop. This is a mistake often made by players. The proper way, generally, in an ending, is to have your pawns on squares of opposite color to that of your own bishop. When you have your pawns on squares of the same color, the action of your own bishop is limited by them, and consequently, the value of the bishop is diminished, since the value of a piece can often be measured by the number of squares it commands. While on this subject, I shall also call attention to the fact that it is generally preferable to keep your pawns on squares of the same color as that of the opposing bishop, particularly if they are passed pawns supported by the king. The principles might be stated thus. When the opponent has a bishop, keep your pawns on squares of the same color as your opponent's bishop. Whenever you have a bishop, whether the opponent has also one or not, Keep your pawns on squares of the opposite color to that of your own bishop. Naturally, these principles have sometimes to be modified to suit the exigencies of the position. In the following position, the pawns are on one side of the board, and there is no advantage in having either a knight or a bishop. The game should surely end in a draw. Now let us add 3 pawns on each side to the above position, so that there are pawns on both sides of the board. It is now preferable to have the bishop, though the position, if properly played out, should end in a draw. The advantage of having the bishop lies as much in its ability to command, at long range, both sides of the board from a central position, as in its ability to move quickly from one side of the board to the other. In the above position, it is unquestionably an advantage to have the bishop because, although each player has the same number of pawns, they are not balanced on each side of the board. Thus, on the king's side, white has 3-2, while on the queen's side, it is black that has 3-2. Still, with proper play, the game should end in a draw, though white has somewhat better chances. Here is a position in which to have the bishop is a decided advantage, since not only are there pawns on both sides of the board, but there is a passed pawn. King rook pawn for white, queen rook pawn for black. Black should have extreme difficulty in drawing this position, if he can do it at all. Again, black would have great difficulty in drawing this position. The student should carefully consider these positions. I hope that the many examples will help him to understand, in their true value, the relative merits of the knight and bishop. As to the general method of procedure, a teacher or practical experience will be best. I might say generally, however, that the proper course in these endings, as in all similar endings, is advance of the king to the center of the board or towards the passed pawns, or pawns that are susceptible of being attacked, and rapid advance of the passed pawn or pawns as far as is consistent with their safety. To give a fixed line of play would be folly. Each ending is different and requires different handling according to what the adversary proposes to do. Calculation by visualizing the future positions is what will count. Now, before going back again to the middle game and the openings, let us see how to mate with knight and bishop, and then how to win with a queen against a rook. With a knight and a bishop, the mate can only be given in the corners of the same color as the bishop. In this example, we must mate either at A1 or H8. The ending can be divided into 2 parts. Part 1 consists in driving the black king to the last line. We might begin, as is generally done in all such cases, by advancing the king to the center of the board. King to E2. Black, in order to make it more difficult, goes towards the white squared corner. King to D3. The first part is now over. The black king is in the white squared corner. The second and last part will consist in driving the black king now from A8 to A1 or H8 in order to mate him. A1 will be the quickest in this position. Black tries to make for H1 with his king. White has 2 ways to prevent that, one by bishop to E5, knight to E3, and the other which I give as the text, and which I consider better for the student to learn because it is more methodical and more in accord with the spirit of all these endings by using the king as much as possible. It will be seen that the ending is rather laborious. There are two outstanding features, the close following by the king and the controlling of the squares of opposite color to the bishop by the combined action of the knight and king. The student would do well to exercise himself methodically in this ending, as it gives a very good idea of the actual power of the pieces, and it requires foresight in order to accomplish the mate within the 50 moves which are granted by the rules. This is one of the most difficult endings without pawns. The resources of the defense are many, and when used skillfully, only a very good player will prevail within the limit of 50 moves allowed by the rules. The rule is that at any moment you may demand that your opponent mate you within 50 moves. However, every time a piece is exchanged or a pawn advanced, the counting must begin afresh. This is one of the standard positions which black can often bring about. Now it is white's move. If it were black's move, it would be simple, as he would have to move his rook away from the king. We will soon find out why, and then the rook would be comparatively easy to win. We deduce from the above that the main object is to force the black rook away from the defending king, and that, in order to compel black to do so, we must bring about the position in the diagram with black to move. Once we know what is required, the way to proceed becomes easier to find. Thus, not queen to a6 because rook to c7, check. Stalemate. The beginner will invariably fall into this trap. Queen to e5, check. In a few moves we have accomplished our object. The first part is concluded. Now we come to the second part. The rook can only go to a white square, otherwise the first check with the queen will win it. Therefore, rook to b3. The student should find out by himself how to win when king to a8, best queen to h8, check. The procedure here is very similar. The things to bear in mind are that the rook must be prevented from interposing at b8 because of an immediate mate, and in the same way, the king must be prevented from going either to a6 or c8. We shall now examine a more difficult position. Many players would be deceived by this position. The most likely looking move is not the best. Thus, suppose we begin. Queen to e5 check. The only defense, but, unfortunately, a very effective one, which makes it very difficult for white since he cannot play queen to e6 because of rook to g7 check, which draws. Nor can he win quickly by queen to c5 check because king to e8, rook to d6 check, driving back the white king. Now that we have seen the difficulties of the situation, let us go back. The best move is queen to g5 check. If king to h7, king to h8. King to h7 best. King to g5, rook to a7 best. If rook to g7, check, king to f6 leads to a position similar to those in examples 40 and 41. Queen to h5, and we have the position of example 40, with black to move. Let us go back again. The best place for the rook, away from the king. king to f6 would lead to positions similar to those already seen. Rook to f3. King to g6 would also win the rook. King to g6. The text move, however, is given to show the finesse of such endings. White now threatens mate at d8. White threatened mate at h8. Queen to f4, check, and the rook is lost. Note in these examples that the checks at long range along the diagonals have often been the key to all the winning maneuvers. Also, that the queen and king are often kept on different lines. The student should carefully go over these positions and consider all the possibilities not given in the text. He should once more go through everything already written before proceeding further with the book.